Amber Mary Bray. On January 16, 1996, Burbank police responded to reports of gunshots at a Warner Brothers executive's home. What they found would reveal a teenage daughter's calculated plan to end her mother's life for financial gain. Amber Mary Bray, 17, had conspired with her 21-year-old boyfriend Jeffrey Glenn Ayers to take the life of her mother, Dixie Lee Hollier, a successful 42-year-old record executive. The plan was methodical and chilling in its detail. Bray left a door unlocked for Ayers to enter, while her mother slept in the early morning hours. Ayers shot Hollier 3 times and stabbed her 24 times with kitchen knives. When Bray's 15-year-old sister Amy heard the commotion and tried to call 911, Bray stopped her by unplugging the phone. The scene was staged to look like a burglary, with $18 and an ATM card taken from Hollier's purse. What drove a teenager to plan her mother's ending? The motive centered entirely on a $310,000 life insurance policy. Letters exchanged between Bray and Ayers revealed their plans to use the money for a home, sports car, and furniture. The correspondence showed detailed planning and cold calculation. In one letter, Bray wrote, "What do you think of this? Someone breaks into the house and kills Amy and Mom. I come home to discover them, call police, neighbors hear nothing, and it goes on record as an unsolved homicide. I like it." Ayers responded, "Your mother and your sister will trouble you no more." The letters became the prosecution's most damning evidence. They showed not just intent, but enthusiasm for the plan. Bray had even drawn a diagram of the home, which prosecutors called a murder blueprint, marking entry points and the locations where the attack should occur. Neighbors heard gunshots around 5 a.m. and called police, who arrived to find Ayers still at the scene. He surrendered immediately, telling officers, "I'm responsible for what happened. I'm fully aware of what I've done." Bray was initially questioned as a witness, but arrested the same day based on the overwhelming evidence and Ayers' confession implicating her as the mastermind. The 1998 trial at Pasadena Superior Court featured separate juries for Bray and Ayers. Prosecutors presented the letters, the home diagram, and powerful testimony from Amy, who described how her sister had prevented her from calling for help. Bray's defense argued the letters reflected future plans and fantasies rather than concrete intent, and suggested Bray had experienced mistreatment from her mother. They claimed the writings were foolish and silly rather than criminal conspiracy. On February 4, 1998, the jury convicted Bray of first-degree murder and conspiracy after 2.5 hours of deliberation. The speed of the verdict reflected the strength of the evidence against her. Ayers was convicted 2 days later. At sentencing on June 30, 1998, Judge Terry Schwartz stated, "Amber Bray and Jeffrey Ayers killed her for the insurance money. Miss Bray was the moving force behind this crime." Both received life without parole. The courtroom reactions showed the complexity of family tragedy. Bray's father, Tom, maintained his belief in her innocence, saying, "I love my daughter very much. I don't believe she's guilty." Even more remarkably, Hollier's mother, Betty Miles, stated, "I still love Amber in spite of everything." Hollier was described as a devoted single mother and capable professional in the entertainment industry. During the attack, she fought back courageously, likely preventing harm to Amy. Under California's Senate Bill 394, juveniles sentenced to life without parole became eligible for parole hearings after 25 years. Amber Bray was granted parole in August 2023 and was released from prison shortly thereafter. As of late 2025, she is no longer incarcerated. The next case would involve questions about self-defense and trafficking that divided public opinion. Cyntoia Brown. On August 7, 2004, 16-year-old Cyntoia Denise Brown shot and killed 43-year-old Johnny Michael Allen in Nashville, Tennessee. Allen, a real estate agent and youth pastor, had picked her up at a Sonic drive-in for a paid encounter costing $150. What happened next would spark a national debate about trafficking, self-defense, and how the justice system treats young victims who commit serious crimes. At Alan's home, Brown claimed she feared for her safety when Alan reached under the bed. Brown testified that she believed he was reaching for a gun. However, she also notably stated during her trial that she thought he was going to kill her because of a perceived move toward the bed. She shot him in the back of the head with a .40 caliber handgun from her purse. She then took $172, 2 firearms, and his truck, which she abandoned at a Walmart. What were the competing narratives about this case? Prosecutors argued robbery was the true motive, pointing to evidence that Alan was asleep when shot, with his hands interlocked under his head, and no weapon nearby. Brown's statements to others severely complicated her self-defense claim. She told a neighbor she shot somebody in the head for $50,000 and some guns, and had blew his brains out. She also threatened the neighbor to stay silent about what she'd revealed. But Brown's defense presented a dramatically different story. She suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, which affected her judgment and impulse control. More significantly, she had been forced into exploitation by a 24-year-old man known as Cutthroat, whose real name was Garyon L. McLaughlin. Her history included traumatic experiences that shaped her worldview and responses to perceived threats. Brown was arrested at a hotel with her exploiter and tried as an adult in 2006. She was convicted of first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated robbery. The evidence included her confessions, forensic analysis showing Alan was likely asleep, and the items she had taken from his home. She was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 51 years, meaning she wouldn't be eligible until age 67. Her sentence was later changed to life with parole following the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which deemed mandatory LWOP for juveniles unconstitutional. This change eventually paved the way for her parole hearings and commutation. The sentencing sparked immediate debate. Her lawyer, Kathy Sinback, argued, "You are basically taking a kid at age 14 or 15 or 16 and making a decision about the rest of their life based on who they are at that age." Detective Charles Robinson offered a contrasting view. Cyntoia Brown did not commit this murder because she was a child sex slave. Her only motivation was robbery. The case gained explosive national attention in 2017 when celebrities including Rihanna shared Brown's story on social media, writing, "Something is horribly wrong when the system enables these rapists and the victim is thrown away for life." The viral campaign, with millions of shares and comments, prompted Governor Bill Haslam to review the case personally. On January 7, 2019, Governor Haslam commuted Brown's sentence to life with parole eligibility after 15 years, followed by 10 years of supervised parole. She was released on August 7, 2019, exactly 15 years after Alan's death. The commutation came after Haslam concluded that the life sentence was too harsh given her age and circumstances at the time of the crime. Since release, Brown has transformed her life completely. She earned both associate and bachelor's degrees, married, and founded a nonprofit organization focused on helping others who have experienced similar circumstances. She advocates for criminal justice reform and speaks publicly about her experiences. Her case continues to spark debate about how the system should handle young trafficking victims who commit serious crimes. Alan's friends portrayed him as helpful and generous, though some witnesses alleged he had displayed concerning behavior toward young women. The case left no simple answers about justice, accountability, and second chances. While Brown's case sparked clemency, the next case would reveal someone who showed no remorse. Miranda Barber. On November 11, 2013, Miranda Barber and her husband Elite carried out a plan that shocked investigators with its casual cruelty. Miranda, 18, and Elliot, 22, had been married just 3 weeks when they decided to end someone's life together for no reason beyond the experience itself. Their victim was Troy LaFerrara, a 42-year-old man Miranda lured through a Craigslist ad offering companionship for $100. Miranda met LaFerrara at the Susquehanna Valley Mall in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Once he entered their Honda CR-V, believing he was meeting someone for a paid encounter, the plan unfolded swiftly. Elite emerged from hiding in the back seat and strangled LaFerrara with a cord, while Miranda stabbed him 20 times. They dumped his body in a wooded area backyard in Sunbury to remove evidence, and went to dinner as if nothing had happened. What motivated this newly married couple to commit such an act? Elite told police during interrogation that they just wanted to murder someone together. The crime appeared to be what investigators classify as a thrill offense, taking a life for the experience itself rather than for financial gain, revenge, or any traditional criminal motive. The confession revealed a disturbing celebration of violence between the newlyweds. Miranda later made sensational claims about involvement in a cult and alleged she had been responsible for over 22 deaths across multiple states, dating back to when she was much younger. She claimed to have participated in numerous similar crimes before LaFerrara. However, FBI and local police conducted extensive investigations and found absolutely no evidence supporting these claims. Investigators concluded the additional murder claims were fabrications designed to create notoriety. Police traced LaFerrara's last phone call to Miranda's number, which became the initial break in the case. When questioned, the couple initially claimed self-defense, suggesting LaFerrara had attacked them. But they eventually confessed to the premeditated and planned nature of the crime. The evidence proved overwhelming. Phone records linking Miranda to the victim, forensics from their vehicle showing biological evidence, and their own detailed admissions about what they had done. Both were charged with criminal homicide, and they pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2014 rather than face trial. On September 18, 2014, they were each sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. During the proceedings, Miranda stated, "I feel it is time to get all of this out. I don't care if people believe me," when discussing her claims about other alleged incidents that investigators had already debunked. The claims about additional cases created a media sensation that briefly made Miranda infamous, but investigators systematically found nothing to substantiate any of them. LaFerrara's death remains their only confirmed victim. The false confessions to additional crimes raised questions about Miranda's mental state and motivations for seeking attention through increasingly dramatic claims. Both Miranda and Elite remain incarcerated in separate Pennsylvania facilities, serving life sentences for the calculated ending of LaFerrara's life. The next case would center on a daughter accused of taking her mother's life in a crime that divided Memphis. Nora Jackson. On June 5, 2005, Memphis woke to news of a brutal crime scene that would captivate the city for years. Jennifer Jackson, a 39-year-old single mother, had been stabbed over 50 times in her upscale East Memphis home. Her 18-year-old daughter, Nora, became the prime suspect, setting off a case that would later expose serious prosecutorial errors and raise fundamental questions about wrongful conviction. Nora had spent the previous evening with friends before arriving home around 11 p.m. She called 911 the following morning after discovering her mother's body in a pool of blood. Investigators immediately noted her demeanor seemed inconsistent with someone who had just found a parent deceased. She had a cut on her hand that prosecutors would later argue came from the weapon slipping during the attack. What evidence pointed to Nora as a suspect? The case relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors argued Nora had motive related to ongoing conflicts with her mother over her lifestyle, friends, and behavior. The hand injury, timeline inconsistencies, and lack of forced entry suggested someone familiar with the home had committed the crime. Critically, no physical evidence directly linked Nora to the crime. No DNA on the weapon, no fingerprints connecting her to the scene, and no witnesses placing her at the home during the attack. Nora was arrested and tried in 2009, 4 years after her mother's death. During the trial, prosecutors built their circumstantial case around her behavior, the hand injury, and what they portrayed as suspicious responses to questioning. The defense argued the evidence was insufficient for conviction beyond reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of forensic evidence. The jury convicted her of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 20 years and 9 months in prison. But the conviction wouldn't stand under scrutiny. Post-conviction investigations revealed that prosecutors had withheld evidence that could have significantly helped Nora's defense. Specifically, they failed to disclose notes from a key witness that directly contradicted the testimony given at trial. This violation of discovery rules, known as a Brady violation after the Supreme Court case establishing the requirement, fundamentally undermined the fairness of the trial. In August 2014, Tennessee's Supreme Court vacated Nora's conviction and ordered a new trial. Prosecutors could have retried her with a properly conducted case, but facing the strong possibility that the previously withheld evidence would now come to light and undermine their case, they offered a deal. In May 2015, Nora entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter, a legal mechanism that allows defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging prosecutors have enough evidence for a potential conviction. She was sentenced to time served, 11 years, and released in August 2016. After release, Nora fought for and won access to her mother's estate, which had been frozen during the lengthy legal proceedings. She has since spoken publicly about her experiences in the justice system and advocated for reform of prosecutorial disclosure requirements to prevent similar Brady violations. Nora maintains her complete innocence to this day. Jennifer Jackson's case remains officially solved with Nora's Alford plea, but serious questions linger about what really happened that night. The withheld evidence and the prosecution's decision to accept a plea rather than retry the case means we may never know the complete truth about who took Jennifer's life. From courtroom errors to questions of manipulation, the next case involves a teenager whose actions shocked California. Catherine Bellflower. On April 3, 2001, the body of 39-year-old Nancy Bellflower was discovered in a sleeping bag in the trunk of her own car, abandoned in a parking lot in Pittsburgh, California. She had been strangled to death. Her daughter, 14-year-old Catherine Katie Bellflower, would soon be arrested alongside her boyfriend, 18-year-old Jason Jazz Zabala, for the crime that shocked the Bay Area community. Catherine and Zabala had been dating for approximately 1 year. According to evidence that would later be presented at trial, Catherine had discussed with Zabala the idea of getting rid of her mother. Nancy's parenting style and household rules had created escalating conflict between mother and daughter. Catherine viewed her mother as an obstacle to her relationship with Zabala and to the independence she craved. How did investigators build their case against the teenage couple? The investigation revealed that Catherine and Zabala had been present when Nancy died. Physical evidence collected from the scene and witness statements placed them both at the location. The forensic evidence painted a picture of what had occurred in Nancy's final moments. After Nancy's death, the teenagers took her car and drove south to Southern California, using her credit cards for purchases and attempting to create both physical and temporal distance from the crime scene. They were arrested in Los Angeles shortly after Nancy's body was found. During interrogation by investigators, evidence emerged about the planning that had preceded the crime and the execution of their plan. The prosecution would build a case arguing that Catherine was an active and willing participant, not just a passive witness or someone manipulated by an older boyfriend into going along with his plan. The trial took place in Contra Costa County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented compelling evidence of premeditation and Catherine's involvement in both the crime itself and the extensive cover-up that followed. They argued the crime showed planning and intent. The defense argued that Zabala was the primary actor and that Catherine had been unduly influenced by him, suggesting she was a victim of manipulation rather than an equal partner in the crime. However, the jury found this argument unconvincing given the substantial evidence of planning and Catherine's active participation. Catherine was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in September 2003. Zabala received a similar sentence for his role as co-perpetrator. The judge emphasized during sentencing the calculated nature of the crime and the profound betrayal inherent in a child taking a parent's life, calling it one of the most fundamental violations of trust in society. Catherine appealed her conviction, arguing various legal errors had occurred during the trial process, but the California Court of Appeal upheld the verdict in 2006. The appellate court found sufficient evidence to support the jury's conclusions about her role in both planning and carrying out the offense against her mother. After serving nearly 2 decades in California's prison system, Catherine was granted parole. She has since worked with organizations focused on rehabilitation and helping others successfully transition from incarceration back into society. She now works with Bonafide, an organization supporting formerly incarcerated individuals in rebuilding their lives, using her own experiences to help others avoid similar destructive paths and make better choices. Nancy Bellflower's family was left to grapple with the permanent loss of a mother taken by her own daughter. The next case would involve claims of a coerced confession and a fight for exoneration that lasted decades. Shanda Crane. In 1998, 16-year-old Shanda Raines was convicted of the 1996 murder of her 81-year-old neighbor, Deloyd D. Moore, in Payne County, Oklahoma. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, joining the ranks of juveniles given the harshest possible punishment under Oklahoma law. But Shanda and her supporters have maintained for over 2 decades that she is innocent, and that her confession was coerced through improper interrogation techniques. The case centered on the death of an elderly neighbor in Payne County. Shanda, a teenager at the time with limited understanding of the legal system, was interrogated by police and eventually gave a confession. That confession became the primary and most damaging evidence leading to her conviction, as physical and forensic evidence linking her to the crime was limited or non-existent. What are the claims about the reliability of this confession? Shanda and her legal team argue the confession was coerced during lengthy interrogation sessions conducted without proper legal representation. They point to well-documented interrogation techniques known to produce false confessions, particularly when used on juveniles who may not fully understand their constitutional rights or the long-term consequences of statements made to authority figures. Research on false confessions shows teenagers are especially vulnerable to suggestion and pressure during police questioning. Her case has been taken up by Georgetown University's Prisons and Justice Initiative, an organization that works to investigate potential wrongful convictions and provide legal support to those claiming innocence. The documentary film Making an Exoneree followed her case closely and the years-long efforts to prove her innocence, bringing national attention to what advocates call a miscarriage of justice. Georgetown's investigation has focused intensively on the circumstances surrounding her confession and whether it meets legal and scientific standards for reliability. The project has presented evidence they believe strongly supports Shanda's innocence claim, including detailed analysis of the interrogation methods used, the lack of physical evidence, and alternative explanations for the crime that were never properly investigated. Shanda Raines was released from prison on February 13, 2024. Following a recommendation from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board and advocacy from Georgetown's Making an Exoneree program, Governor Kevin Stitt commuted her sentence to time served. Shanda's case raises critical questions about juvenile interrogations, the documented unreliability of certain confession types, and how the justice system handles claims of innocence decades after conviction when the original physical evidence may be lost or degraded. Her supporters continue to advocate tirelessly for her release, arguing that she has spent over 2 decades imprisoned for a crime she didn't commit, and that justice delayed has become justice denied. The victim's family, meanwhile, believes justice was properly served with Shanda's conviction. They maintain that the confession was truthful and voluntary, and that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to support the jury's verdict. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would involve a crime that shocked Texas with its calculated nature. Chelsea Richardson. In January 2003, the small town of Mansfield, Texas, was rocked by the double homicide of Rick and Susanna Wamsley. The couple was found shot and stabbed in their home, a crime scene that revealed both careful planning and shocking brutality. At the center of the investigation was 19-year-old Chelsea Richardson, along with her 15-year-old friend Susanna Toledano, who had been living with the Richardson family. Chelsea had befriended Susanna, who was experiencing difficulties at home and seeking stability. Susanna moved in with the Richardson family, grateful for what seemed like a supportive environment. But prosecutors would argue that Chelsea had deliberately manipulated this vulnerable teenager into participating in a calculated plan to eliminate Rick and Susanna Wamsley. The motive appeared to center on control and freedom from parental authority, with Chelsea resenting the rules and limitations her parents imposed. How did this teenage friendship turn deadly? On the night of the attacks, both Rick and Susanna Wamsley were shot and stabbed multiple times in their own home. The crime scene showed signs of a planned assault rather than a spontaneous act of rage. Evidence would later show that Chelsea had obtained weapons beforehand and enlisted Susanna in carrying out the coordinated attacks on her own parents. The level of violence used against both victims shocked investigators. The investigation moved quickly once authorities began examining the circumstances. Physical evidence at the scene, witness statements from neighbors and friends, and the girls' own accounts to investigators built a compelling case against both teenagers. Chelsea was identified as the primary instigator who had convinced and manipulated Susanna to participate. The nature of the relationship between the two became a central focus of both the investigation and subsequent trial. Chelsea was charged with capital murder for the deaths of both parents. Given the severity of the charges and the fact that 2 victims had been killed during a single criminal transaction, prosecutors sought the death penalty. The trial painted Chelsea as a calculating manipulator who had used her influence over the younger, more vulnerable Susanna to carry out her plan to eliminate parental control. During the trial, Susanna testified for the prosecution, describing in detail how Chelsea had orchestrated the attacks. Her testimony provided crucial details about the planning stages and the execution of the crime. The prosecution argued that Chelsea bore primary responsibility as the mastermind who had exploited a vulnerable teenager to help eliminate obstacles to her desired lifestyle of complete freedom. Chelsea was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, making her one of the youngest women on Texas's death row at the time. The death sentence reflected both the heinousness of the crime involving 2 victims and Texas's willingness to impose capital punishment even on young offenders who commit particularly serious crimes. She joined a small group of women awaiting execution in Texas, but the death sentence wouldn't stand permanently. After years of appeals and legal challenges regarding sentencing of young offenders, Chelsea's sentence was eventually commuted to life with the possibility of parole. Under Texas law for capital murder committed at that time, she must serve 40 calendar years before becoming eligible for parole. Chelsea remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System under inmate number 01372273. Her first eligibility date is listed as September 30th, 2044. The Walmsley family was left devastated by the loss of both Rick and Susanna, killed by their own daughter with the help of a teenager they had welcomed into their home with open arms. Susanna, as a cooperating witness and given her younger age at the time, received a lesser sentence. While that case involved family betrayal, the next centered on teenage rivalry taken to a fatal extreme. Rachel Wade. On April 14, 2009, an argument over a boyfriend erupted into fatal confrontation in Pinellas Park, Florida. Rachel Wade, 19, confronted Sarah Ludeman, 18, in a dispute that had been building intensity for months. Both young women had been involved with the same man, and their rivalry had escalated dramatically through text messages, phone calls, and increasingly hostile confrontations. That night, the conflict would end with Sarah's death and Rachel's conviction. The two had exchanged hundreds of hostile text messages and threatening phone calls over several months. Friends of both women knew about the ongoing feud over their shared romantic interest. The tension had been building steadily, with each confrontation becoming more heated and threatening. On the night of the incident, Sarah and friends drove to Rachel's location for what would become the final confrontation in their escalating rivalry. What happened during that fatal encounter? During the confrontation, Rachel stabbed Sarah in the chest with a kitchen knife she had brought with her. The blade punctured Sarah's heart, causing massive internal bleeding. Sarah died shortly after from the catastrophic wound. Forensic evidence showed the knife blade had bent from the significant force of the stabbing, indicating the violence involved in the attack. Rachel claimed self-defense, arguing that Sarah and her friends had come to confront her at her location, and that she had felt genuinely threatened by the group. However, prosecutors argued that Rachel had armed herself with the knife before the confrontation even began, showing premeditation rather than defensive preparation. The months of escalating conflict and increasingly threatening messages between the two undermined the self-defense claim significantly. Rachel was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The trial in 2010 became a widely discussed cautionary tale about how teenage romantic drama can escalate into life-and-death tragedy. Prosecutors presented the extensive text message history showing the deteriorating relationship between Rachel and Sarah, and Rachel's increasingly aggressive and violent threats. The jury heard detailed testimony about the rivalry, the specific threats exchanged between the two young women, and the precise events of that fatal night. Sarah's friends testified about the confrontation and the moments leading up to the stabbing, while Rachel's defense maintained she had acted to protect herself from what she perceived as a threatening situation involving multiple people. On September 3, 2010, Rachel was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. The judge emphasized that Rachel had armed herself with a deadly weapon before the confrontation, fundamentally undermining her self-defense claims. The sentence reflected the seriousness of taking a life over a romantic rivalry that could have been resolved through less violent means. As of 2025, Rachel remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections. She has discussed her case in videos and interviews from prison, continuing to frame the incident as self-defense. Her current scheduled release date is May 23, 2032. From teenage rivalry, we turn to a case involving claims of long-term family dysfunction. Rachel Mullenix. In August 2006, Barbara Mullenix was found stabbed to death in her California home. The 47-year-old mother had been stabbed 52 times in a frenzied attack, and her body was later found in Newport Harbor, stuffed into a cardboard box that had been weighed down. Her 18-year-old daughter, Rachel Mullenix, and Rachel's boyfriend Ian Allen would both be arrested for the crime. But this case would raise complex questions about family dynamics, manipulation, and who bore primary responsibility for the tragic outcome. Rachel's brother Alex has spoken extensively about their mother's behavior over the years, describing her as having a Jekyll and Hyde personality. He described control tactics and erratic behavior that created a difficult and unstable home environment for both children. The family situation was marked by ongoing conflict and tension, with Barbara's behavior creating lasting psychological impacts on both children that would affect them into adulthood. What led to the fatal confrontation? On the night of the attack, Barbara was stabbed 52 times in what prosecutors described as an act of extreme rage. The prosecution would argue this showed intense anger and clear intent to end her life. Her body was later dumped in a remote location away from the home, an attempt to conceal the crime and delay discovery by authorities. The investigation revealed that Rachel's boyfriend, Ian Allen, had been the primary actor in the physical attack on Barbara. However, prosecutors argued that Rachel had participated in both the crime itself and the extensive cover-up that followed. The defense maintained that Ian had manipulated Rachel, exploiting the already difficult relationship she had with her mother and using it to convince her to go along with his plan. The trial explored the complex family dynamics in depth. While this evidence didn't excuse the crime, it provided important context for understanding how the situation had deteriorated to such a tragic point. Testimony about Barbara's behavior raised questions about the environment Rachel had grown up in, and how it might have affected her judgment, decision-making abilities, and vulnerability to manipulation by someone like Ian. In 2008, Rachel was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. Ian Allen received a similar sentence for his role as the primary perpetrator of the physical attack. The sentencing reflected both the severe nature of the crime and some judicial consideration of the mitigating circumstances involving the documented family dysfunction. After serving approximately 14 years of her sentence, Rachel was released on October 14, 2022. She now lives with her father in Southern California, attempting to rebuild her life after nearly a decade and a half behind bars and working to reintegrate into society. Her brother Alex has publicly stated she's suffered enough, supporting her release and publicly acknowledging the complexity of their family situation. His willingness to maintain a relationship with Rachel despite their mother's death speaks to his understanding of the family dynamics that preceded the tragedy and his belief in his sister's capacity for rehabilitation. The next case involves two teenagers whose relationship led to an unthinkable family tragedy. Holly Harvey and Sandra Ketchum. Holly Harvey was 15 and Sandra Ketchum was 16 when they committed a crime that shocked Georgia in August 2004. The two were in a romantic relationship that Holly's grandparents, Carl and Sarah Collier, disapproved of strongly. Holly had been raised by her grandparents and lived under their rules and structure, which included strict restrictions on her relationship with Sandra. According to court documents, Holly had grown up without consistent rules or structure before moving in with her grandparents. The Colliers attempted to provide stability, boundaries, and guidance, but this created significant conflict with Holly, who strongly resented the limitations placed on her relationship with Sandra. The grandparents' repeated attempts to separate the girls or limit their contact became a source of escalating tension in the household. What drove these teenagers to such an extreme act? On the night of the attacks, both Carl and Sarah Collier were stabbed multiple times in their own home, where they had tried to provide a safe environment for Holly. The crime scene revealed the brutal and personal nature of the attacks. Both grandparents died from their injuries, victims of the two teenagers they had tried to guide and protect from what they saw as a harmful relationship. Evidence showed the crime had been discussed and planned between Holly and Sandra beforehand. The planning indicated this wasn't an impulsive act committed in the heat of an argument, but rather a calculated decision to permanently remove the obstacles to their relationship. The investigation revealed communications between the girls about their intentions and what they planned to do. Holly and Sandra were both arrested and faced serious murder charges. Rather than go to trial and risk potentially harsher sentences, both teenagers pleaded guilty in 2005. The guilty pleas meant they would avoid the uncertainty of a jury trial, but would face significant prison sentences for their roles in the deaths. Holly Harvey was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Under Georgia law at the time of her 2005 sentencing, she was required to serve at least 20 years for each life sentence before being eligible for parole. This means her total minimum time before parole eligibility is 40 years. Her earliest possible release date is in 2044. Holly attempted to appeal her conviction and sentence, but the Georgia Supreme Court dismissed her appeal in 2006 and upheld the denial of her habeas corpus petition in 2015. The court found no legal grounds to overturn her guilty plea or modify her sentence. The appeal argued various legal and procedural points, but the court determined the original proceedings had been conducted properly and fairly. Sandra Ketchum was sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms. Because her sentences run concurrently at the same time, she is eligible for parole after serving 20 years. As of 2025, both Holly and Sandra remain incarcerated in the Georgia Department of Corrections. The forensic evidence revealed the brutal and personal nature of the stabbings, with both victims suffering multiple wounds in what appeared to be a sustained attack. The Collier family was left devastated by the loss of Carl and Sarah, who had been trying to provide a stable and loving home for their troubled granddaughter. From a case about forbidden romance, we turn to one involving a teenage girl caught up in her boyfriend's crime spree. Megan Grunwald. In January 2014, 17-year-old Megan Grunwald was behind the wheel during a crime spree that left Utah County Sheriff Sergeant Corey Ride dead and shook the law enforcement community. Her boyfriend, Jose Angel Garcia Jaregui, was the shooter who pulled the trigger, but Megan faced serious charges for her role as the driver during the pursuit and shooting that followed. Sergeant Ride had stopped to help what appeared to be a stranded motorist on a rural road when Garcia Jaregui suddenly shot him without warning. The sergeant was killed while attempting to provide assistance. The couple then fled in the vehicle with Megan driving at high speeds. During the subsequent high-speed chase with multiple law enforcement agencies, Garcia Jaregui fired at pursuing officers from the vehicle. Forensic evidence showed numerous shots were fired from the vehicle during the dangerous chase, endangering multiple law enforcement officers. How did a teenage girl end up involved in such serious crimes? The prosecution argued forcefully that Megan was an active and willing participant who made conscious choices to continue driving even after witnessing the shooting, making her fully complicit in the crimes that followed. The defense maintained that she was under Garcia Jaregui's control and feared for her own safety if she didn't comply with his increasingly dangerous demands during the pursuit. The case divided public opinion sharply. Some saw Megan as a victim of her boyfriend's violence who had been forced into an impossible situation with no clear way out. Others argued she had multiple opportunities to stop the vehicle, surrender to police, or refuse to participate but had instead chosen to continue fleeing from law enforcement. Megan was convicted and initially faced a lengthy sentence that could have kept her imprisoned for decades. The conviction held her accountable for her role in the crimes, even though Garcia Jaregui had been the person who actually fired the fatal shots. The trial examined her level of knowledge about what was happening and her willingness to participate in the flight from police. Megan Grunwald was originally sentenced to 30 years to life, 25 to life for murder plus 5 for other charges. In 2020, the Utah Supreme Court overturned her convictions for several secondary charges, aggravated robbery and attempted murder, but upheld the murder conviction. Megan remains incarcerated in a Utah prison facility as the parole board carefully considers its decision. Our final case involves a teenager who became a key witness against her friend. Susana Toledano. Susana Toledano was 15 years old when she participated in the 2003 murders of Rick and Susanna Walmsley, the same crime that put Chelsea Richardson on death row before her sentence was reduced. Susanna's case illustrates how vulnerability, need for acceptance, and manipulation can draw young people into participating in serious crimes they might never have contemplated on their own. Susanna had been experiencing significant difficulties with her own family when she met Chelsea Richardson. The older teenager befriended Susanna during this vulnerable period and eventually invited her to live with the Richardson family in Mansfield, Texas. What seemed like an act of genuine friendship and support would prove to be the beginning of a tragic manipulation that would end in murder. Chelsea allegedly manipulated Susanna into participating in the coordinated attacks on Andrew Walmsley's parents. Both Rick and Susanna were shot and stabbed in their home in what prosecutors described as a calculated plan. The crime scene showed a level of planning and brutality that shocked investigators and the tight-knit community. Why did Susanna participate in such a terrible crime? Prosecutors and psychologists who examined the case suggested that Chelsea had deliberately and carefully exploited Susanna's vulnerability and desperate need for acceptance and belonging. At 15, Susanna was significantly younger and more easily influenced than the 19-year-old Chelsea. The prosecution argued that Chelsea had carefully cultivated the relationship over time to create someone who would help her carry out her plan to eliminate her parents. During Chelsea's trial, Susanna testified for the prosecution, providing crucial and detailed testimony about how Chelsea had orchestrated and planned the attacks. Her testimony was instrumental in securing Chelsea's conviction and death sentence. By fully cooperating with prosecutors, Susanna demonstrated an understanding of the extreme severity of what had occurred and a willingness to take responsibility for her role. Susanna was convicted but received a significantly lighter sentence than Chelsea due to her younger age, her extensive cooperation with prosecutors, and the recognition by the court that she had been manipulated. Susanna Toledano was sentenced to life in prison as part of a plea deal for testifying against Chelsea and Andrew. Under the specific Texas statutes for her 2005 conviction, she is eligible for parole after 30 calendar years. Her first eligibility date is December 10, 2033. She is currently serving her sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System under inmate number 013145546. Given her cooperation with authorities, her young age at the time of the crime, and her demonstrated remorse, she may have realistic opportunities for parole consideration as she approaches the 30-year mark of her sentence. As of 2025, Susanna remains incarcerated, serving her sentence for the role she played in the deaths of Rick and Susanna Walmsley. Her case serves as a stark reminder of how easily vulnerable young people can be manipulated into participating in terrible crimes, and how those who cooperate fully with authorities may receive more lenient treatment than the primary instigators. The Walmsley family lost both Rick and Susanna in a crime that involved not just their daughter, but also a teenager they had welcomed into their home with kindness and compassion. The tragedy illustrates how acts of generosity and kindness can sometimes be exploited by those with harmful intentions, and how family trust and hospitality can be weaponized with absolutely devastating and irreversible consequences for entire families and communities. Natalie Fenton. In 1999, New Zealand witnessed one of its youngest offenders commit an act that would shock the nation. Natalie Fenton, just 14 years old, participated in the fatal stabbing of 22-year-old Peter Crane. The case exposed how teenage thrill-seeking could escalate into irreversible tragedy. Fenton and a 15-year-old accomplice lured Crane to a park where they attacked her with knives. Crane was stabbed over 20 times before being left to die. The brutality of the attack suggested either rage or complete emotional detachment during the assault. The multiple wounds indicated sustained effort rather than a single panicked moment. The motive remained somewhat unclear, though investigators believed robbery or thrill-seeking played roles. Fenton had a troubled background, with early involvement in criminal activity, suggesting a pattern of escalating behavior before the fatal encounter. The attack on Crane represented the culmination of antisocial tendencies that hadn't been successfully addressed. How did authorities connect Fenton to the crime? Police investigations identified witnesses who had seen the teenagers with Crane before her body was discovered. Physical evidence from the scene linked both attackers to the location. When questioned, the evidence proved overwhelming, leading to arrests of both Fenton and her accomplice. The trial in 2000 resulted in a conviction on charges related to Crane's death. At 14, Fenton became one of New Zealand's youngest individuals convicted of such a serious offense. The case raised questions about how the justice system should handle offenders barely into their teenage years, who commit acts typically associated with hardened criminals. Fenton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years. The relatively short minimum reflected her youth at the time of offense, though the life sentence acknowledged the severity of taking Crane's life. New Zealand's approach attempted to balance accountability with recognition of developmental factors affecting teenage decision-making. During her incarceration, Fenton experienced circumstances that would complicate her life further. She had a son while in prison, and that child witnessed aftermath of another incident involving Fenton, creating intergenerational trauma. The son would later develop his own criminal patterns, illustrating how incarcerated parents' circumstances can affect their offspring. In 2016, after serving 17 years, Fenton was released on parole. The decision sparked controversy, particularly from Crane's family, who had serious concerns about Fenton's reintegration into society. They believed insufficient time had passed for genuine rehabilitation and feared for public safety. Crane's family stated, "She will reoffend, we're sure," expressing their conviction that Fenton remained dangerous despite completing her minimum sentence. Their concerns reflected not just grief over losing Peter, but genuine worry based on their assessment of Fenton's character and lack of remorse. As of recent years, information about Fenton's activities post-release remains limited in public records. Whether she has successfully reintegrated or whether her family's fears were justified remains largely unknown outside official channels that monitor released offenders. The next case would take us to Scotland, where a party turned deadly. Jolene Doherty. In January 2018, a house party in Holytown, Scotland, ended with 18-year-old Connor Cowper bleeding to death from a neck wound. The person responsible was 17-year-old Jolene Doherty, who was pregnant at the time and heavily intoxicated on cocaine and alcohol. The case would make her one of Scotland's youngest convicted in such circumstances. Cowper had called Doherty a stupid wee girl during the party, an insult that would prove fatal. Doherty's reaction was immediate and extreme. She stabbed him in the neck. Cowper was essentially a stranger to her, making the attack even more shocking. The lack of prior relationship meant this wasn't about accumulated grievances, but rather instantaneous rage. The party setting meant multiple witnesses observed what occurred. Attendees provided statements describing the confrontation and stabbing, creating a clear picture of events. The combination of witness testimony and physical evidence made Doherty's involvement undeniable. She confessed to the act, acknowledging she had stabbed Cowper during the altercation. What made this teenager capable of such violence? Doherty was under the influence of both cocaine and alcohol when the incident occurred, substances that impaired her judgment and lowered inhibitions. However, the drugs and alcohol didn't create violent tendencies from nothing. They removed filters that normally prevent people from acting on aggressive impulses. The combination of intoxication, access to a weapon, and an insult created deadly circumstances. The trial highlighted Doherty's apparent lack of empathy for what she had done. Evaluations suggested she didn't fully grasp the permanence of taking Cowper's life, showing emotional disconnection from the consequences. This detachment disturbed observers who expected at least some remorse from someone so young. The judge noted during sentencing, "You were high on drugs and had access to a weapon," emphasizing how these factors combined to create the fatal situation. The statement captured how individual poor choices, drug use, weapon carrying, intersected to produce tragedy that might have been avoided if any single factor had been different. Doherty was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, becoming one of Scotland's youngest convicted in such serious circumstances. The life sentence reflected both the gravity of taking Cowper's life and society's determination to hold even young offenders accountable for deadly actions. Scottish law, like many jurisdictions, treats certain crimes as serious regardless of the perpetrator's age. Her pregnancy at the time of both the offense and trial added complexity to the case. Questions arose about what would happen to her offspring once born, whether she would raise the child from prison, and how her incarceration would affect that young person's development. The situation created another victim, a child who would grow up knowing their mother was imprisoned for taking a life. Cowper's mother expressed devastation, stating she was "glad I've not got any more kids," due to fears about youth knife crime. Her words reflected how one family's tragedy rippled outward, affecting her perspective on society and safety. The loss of Connor changed not just her life, but her entire worldview about the dangers young people face. Doherty remains incarcerated in Scotland, serving her life sentence. Another case would involve a daughter and her father, Crystal Howell. In July 2014, Michael Howell took a nap in his North Carolina home, a routine afternoon rest that would prove fatal. His 17-year-old daughter, Crystal, shot him in the head while he slept on the couch. What followed would shock investigators. Crystal hid her father's body in a shed and proceeded to use his house for parties for months. The shooting appeared impulsive, according to Crystal's later statements, though the planning required to hide the body and maintain the deception suggested more calculation than momentary loss of control. She wrapped Michael's body and stored it in a shed on the property, then continued living in the house as if nothing had happened. For months, Crystal hosted parties and used her father's vehicle and belongings. Guests who attended these gatherings had no idea Michael's body was stored just feet away. She spent money from his accounts and maintained appearances that he was alive, creating stories about his whereabouts when people asked about him. How did the discovery finally occur? Party guests eventually stumbled upon Michael's body in the shed. The discovery triggered immediate police involvement and Crystal's arrest. She was found driving Michael's vehicle when authorities located her, having fled after the body was found. Physical evidence from the scene and the shed connected her to both the shooting and the concealment. During interrogation, Crystal cited mental health struggles and described the shooting as happening so fast, like an impulse. Her statement attempted to characterize the act as unplanned, though prosecutors argued that hiding the body and using his estate demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and deliberate choices to continue benefiting from his death. The investigation revealed no clear motive beyond the vague references to impulse and mental health issues. Unlike cases where financial gain or escape from strict parenting drive offspring to harm parents, Crystal's reasoning remained murky. She hadn't been in immediate danger, wasn't prevented from leaving, and stood to gain little materially from Michael's death that she couldn't have accessed by other means. Crystal pleaded guilty to charges related to her father's death, avoiding trial. The guilty plea acknowledged her responsibility while allowing her to avoid the process of having prosecutors present detailed evidence of her actions. For Michael's extended family, the plea provided some accountability without requiring them to endure a lengthy trial. In 2023, Crystal was sentenced to 30 years in prison with additional time for related charges. The sentence meant she would be in her late 40s at minimum before any possibility of release. North Carolina's sentencing reflected both the shooting itself and her actions afterward, the parties, the spending, the months of deception. Years later, Crystal broke her silence in media interviews, discussing the case from her perspective. She described struggling with mental health issues that weren't adequately addressed before the shooting. Her statements attempted to provide context, though they couldn't justify or undo what occurred. Crystal remains incarcerated in North Carolina, serving her 30-year sentence. But the next case would involve a young victim in the UK. Killing of Katie Ruff. In January 2017, York, England experienced a tragedy that would raise difficult questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. A 15-year-old girl, whose identity remains protected under UK law, ended the life of 7-year-old Katie Ruff through suffocation and post-incident actions. The case exposed the intersection of severe mental illness and deadly intent. The perpetrator suffered from psychosis and delusions that distorted her perception of reality. Mental health evaluations revealed she experienced thoughts that she believed required action, though the specific content of these delusions wasn't fully disclosed to protect both her privacy and prevent copycat situations. The delusions were severe enough to affect her judgment, but not so complete that she couldn't plan and execute the attack. Katie was targeted in what appeared to be both premeditated and opportunistic. The teenager had thought about harming someone, but selected Katie as the specific victim based on availability and vulnerability. The combination of planning with opportunistic victim selection made the case particularly disturbing. What happened after Katie's death? The perpetrator called emergency services herself, confessing to what she had done. Her immediate report to authorities suggested either overwhelming guilt or recognition that concealment was impossible. The confession provided investigators with information about the attack and the teenager's state of mind. Medical examination confirmed Katie died from suffocation. Additional actions taken after death raised questions about the perpetrator's mindset and whether these were driven by delusions or other factors. The forensic evidence supported the confession's account of events. Mental health became the central focus of legal proceedings. Defense attorneys emphasized that the teenager was extremely troubled and suffering from genuine psychiatric conditions that affected her capacity. They didn't deny she caused Katie's death, but argued mental illness should be considered in determining culpability and appropriate response. The teenager pleaded guilty to manslaughter rather than the more serious charge, acknowledging her role while the plea reflected recognition of her diminished capacity due to mental illness. The manslaughter plea allowed the court to focus on appropriate sentencing given her psychological state, rather than debating whether she met the full legal standard for conviction on the higher charge. In November 2017, she was sentenced to life detention with a minimum term of 5 years before parole consideration. The relatively short minimum reflected her youth, mental illness, and the court's determination that she required treatment more than pure punishment. The life component meant she would remain under supervision indefinitely, with release dependent on demonstrating she no longer posed danger. For Katie Ruff's family, the sentence sparked mixed reactions. Some viewed the minimum term as too lenient for taking a young life, while others acknowledged that mental illness complicated straightforward notions of justice. The family had to process not just Katie's loss, but also the knowledge that her death resulted from another young person's psychiatric breakdown. The perpetrator remains in secure mental health detention in the UK, receiving treatment for her conditions while serving her sentence. Her eventual release will depend on psychiatric evaluations determining she no longer represents a risk. Another case would cross the Atlantic to Alaska.
Fletcher, who was convicted as a teenager for the murder of Ann Faccio and Emma Elliott in 1985, will now have her prison sentence reconsidered after a decision from the Alaska Court of Appeals. Good evening.
Winona Fletcher. In 2000, Alaska witnessed 16-year-old Winona Fletcher become the youngest female convicted in the state's history for her role in ending someone's life. The case would span decades through Alaska's justice system, as courts grappled with how to handle someone so young, convicted of such serious actions. Fletcher participated in an incident that resulted in a death, though specific details about her exact role and the victim have limited availability in public records. What is clear is that her conviction at 16 made her conviction historic for Alaska's justice system, creating precedent about handling juvenile offenders. The original sentencing reflected Alaska's approach at the time to serious juvenile offenses. Fletcher received a lengthy term that would keep her incarcerated well into adulthood. For years, she served her sentence in Alaska's correctional system, aging from teenager to adult while behind bars. How did her case evolve over time? Legal changes affecting juvenile sentencing created opportunities for Fletcher to seek resentencing. Supreme Court decisions about juvenile life sentences prompted reviews of cases where offenders were minors at the time of their crimes. These rulings reflected evolving understanding of adolescent brain development and capacity for rehabilitation. In September 2025, Fletcher appeared for resentencing, seeking a reduced sentence based on her youth at the time of offense and her conduct during decades of incarceration. The proceedings examined whether she had been rehabilitated and whether continued incarceration served any purpose beyond punishment. The judge ultimately ordered Fletcher's release, determining she had served sufficient time given her age at offense and her behavior while imprisoned. The decision considered the 25 years she had spent incarcerated, her participation in programs and evaluations suggesting she no longer posed significant risk to public safety. The resentencing created a battle over Fletcher's future, with prosecutors arguing she should remain imprisoned, while defense attorneys emphasized rehabilitation potential and the excessive nature of her original sentence for someone who was 16 at the time. The competing arguments reflected broader debates about juvenile justice. For the victim's family, Fletcher's release represented another loss. They had expected her to remain imprisoned for life and struggled with the court's determination that she deserved freedom. Victim impact statements described ongoing grief and concern about Fletcher being released back into society. Fletcher's future remains uncertain as she adjusts to life outside prison after spending her entire adult life incarcerated. The skills needed to navigate modern society differ dramatically from those in 2000 when she entered prison. Support systems and monitoring will be crucial in determining whether her release proves successful. The next case would involve a tragic incident in Delaware. Annika Stalczynski. In October 2020, Delaware experienced a tragedy involving teenagers that would result in multiple prosecutions. Annika Stalczynski, then 16, participated in circumstances that led to the death of Madison Sparrow. The case exposed how teenage relationships and conflicts can escalate to fatal outcomes. Stalczynski was involved with Noah Sharp in an incident targeting Sparrow, a former friend whose relationship with Stalczynski had deteriorated. The motive appeared connected to interpersonal conflicts typical of teenage social dynamics, but with deadly escalation. What should have remained verbal disputes or ended friendships instead became fatal. The method used to end Sparrow's life involved actions that demonstrated planning rather than spontaneous rage. Sharp and Stalczynski worked together, with both participating in the attack. The coordination between them showed this wasn't an isolated decision by one person, but rather a jointly executed plan. What evidence connected Stalczynski to Sparrow's death? Forensic evidence from the scene established what occurred and who was present. Witness testimony, including from individuals who knew about the plan, provided additional information about premeditation and execution. Digital communications between Stalczynski, Sharp, and others revealed discussions about their intentions toward Sparrow. Stalczynski's former friend testified during proceedings, providing insider perspective on the relationships and conflicts that preceded Sparrow's death. The testimony described how tensions escalated and how the plan developed. The witness accounts painted a picture of deteriorating friendships that spiraled toward tragedy. Both Stalczynski and Sharp faced trial in Delaware. In October 2022, guilty verdicts were secured against both, with the jury determining they bore responsibility for Sparrow's death. The convictions reflected the strength of evidence demonstrating their joint participation. Stalczynski's sentence reflected her youth at the time of offense, while acknowledging the severity of taking Sparrow's life. Delaware's justice system balanced these competing considerations, resulting in a lengthy term, but one that provided eventual possibility of release, unlike some jurisdictions that impose true life without parole on juveniles. Sharp received his own conviction and sentence for his role as a co-participant. The separate proceedings allowed courts to evaluate each person's individual culpability while acknowledging they worked together. The sentences reflected Delaware's determination that both bore significant responsibility regardless of who played which specific role. For Sparrow's family, the convictions provided accountability but couldn't restore their daughter. They had lost someone young with their entire future ahead of them over teenage conflicts that should have been resolved through normal social processes rather than deadly confrontation. Victim impact statements described permanent grief and the void left by Sparrow's absence. Stalczynski remains incarcerated in Delaware, serving her sentence. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Another case would involve a mother-daughter conflict in Ohio. Mindy Barany. In 1989, Ohio witnessed a case that divided opinion about whether a teenager acted in self-defense or committed premeditated harm. Mindy Barany, at 17, shot and ended the life of her mother, Marie Poling. The circumstances surrounding the shooting would spark debate about parental treatment and teenage responses that last decades. Barany claimed her mother had created an intolerable home environment. She described years of difficulties that she said drove her to desperate measures, though family members disputed these characterizations. The conflicting accounts made determining the truth difficult, with Mindy's version contrasting sharply with how other relatives remembered Marie. On the day of the shooting, Mindy used a firearm to end her mother's life. The location and circumstances of the shooting became crucial evidence in determining whether this was self-defense, as Mindy claimed, or something more calculated. Forensic analysis examined the physical evidence to reconstruct what occurred. The investigation revealed details that complicated Mindy's self-defense narrative. Evidence suggested planning rather than spontaneous reaction to immediate threat. The positioning of Marie's body, the trajectory of the shot, and other forensic details raised questions about whether Mindy faced imminent danger at the moment she fired. Family members took opposing positions on Mindy's culpability. Some supported her claims about Marie's treatment and viewed the shooting as tragic but understandable given alleged circumstances. Others defended Marie's character and insisted Mindy's accusations were fabrications designed to justify premeditated harm. The family division meant there was no unified narrative about what happened or why. What did the courts determine? Mindy was convicted on charges related to her mother's death, with the jury rejecting her self-defense claims. The verdict reflected their determination that evidence didn't support immediate danger requiring deadly force. Ohio's legal standards for self-defense are strict, requiring reasonable belief of imminent harm that can only be stopped through force used. Berenyi was sentenced to a lengthy prison term that would keep her incarcerated for decades. The sentence balanced her youth at the time of offense against the severity of taking her mother's life. Ohio's approach reflected determination to hold her accountable while acknowledging developmental factors. Appeals followed, with Mindy's legal team challenging various aspects of her conviction and sentence. The appeals process examined whether she received fair trial and appropriate sentence given her age. Multiple levels of Ohio courts reviewed the case, generally upholding the conviction while occasionally modifying sentence details. During her incarceration, Mindy maintained her version of events. She continued asserting that Marie's treatment drove her to act and that she genuinely believed she was in danger. The consistency of her narrative over decades suggested either genuine belief in her version or determination to maintain the self-defense story regardless of evidence. Years into her sentence, questions remained about what truly motivated the shooting. Was it years of accumulated resentment that Mindy genuinely believed justified her actions? Was it teenage rebellion taken to an extreme? Or was it calculated harm for reasons Mindy never fully disclosed? The answers likely died with Marie. Mindy served decades in Ohio's correctional system before any release considerations. Her case highlighted how family conflicts, when they escalate beyond normal bounds, can produce tragedies that destroy multiple lives. Whether victim or perpetrator, or some complex combination, Mindy's teenage choice ensured she would spend most of her adult life imprisoned. While that case involved disputed family dynamics, the next would expose clear intent. Meredith Poling. In 2000, Trumbull County, Ohio experienced another mother-daughter tragedy when Meredith Poling, the sister of the aforementioned Marie, faced her own daughter's actions. However, Meredith's case details are limited in public records, with the primary available information relating to the broader family tragedy that affected multiple generations. What is documented suggests that Meredith became entangled in family circumstances that had already produced one death. The Poling family faced recurring issues across generations, with patterns of conflict escalating to harm. The intergenerational nature of family dysfunction raised questions about whether cycles could be broken or if destructive patterns inevitably repeated. Meredith's relationship with her daughter appears to have been troubled, mirroring in some ways the difficulties that plagued other family branches. Financial stress, communication breakdowns, and accumulating resentments created volatile household dynamics. These factors, common in many families, occasionally escalate beyond verbal conflict into physical confrontation. The specific circumstances of what occurred in Meredith's household remain somewhat unclear in available sources. What is evident is that her daughter faced legal consequences for actions taken within their home. The Ohio justice system intervened, examining evidence and determining appropriate accountability. How did this case differ from her sister Marie's situation? While both involved mother-daughter conflicts reaching extreme outcomes, the specifics of evidence, claimed justifications, and ultimate legal determinations varied. Each case required individual evaluation, rather than treating them as identical simply because they occurred in related family branches. Ohio courts examined the particular facts of Meredith's situation separately. The parallel tragedies within one extended family prompted discussions about whether genetic or environmental factors contributed to repeated patterns. Mental health professionals examined whether family-wide dysfunction suggested treatable conditions that, if addressed earlier, might have prevented escalation. However, such analysis necessarily remained speculative without full access to family medical and psychological histories. In 2025, Meredith Poling died while still incarcerated, never experiencing freedom after her conviction. Her death in prison meant she served the entirety of her remaining life behind bars. For her family, the death represented another loss layered on top of the tragedy that initially resulted in her incarceration. Another case would involve a Florida teenager and her mother.
In 1998, Vicki Robinson was brutally killed in one of the most high-profile murders this area's ever seen. 3 people, including Robinson's own daughter, Valessa, just 15 years old at the time, were convicted. But within hours, that formerly long-haired teen will be released from prison earlier than expected. And tonight, Robinson's friends can't help but feel conflicted.
Valessa Robinson. In June 1998, Tampa, Florida witnessed a case that shocked the community. Valessa Robinson, 15, participated with her boyfriend in ending her mother Vicki's life. The case exposed how teenage romantic relationships can lead to devastating choices when combined with drug use and parental conflict. Vicki Robinson's body was discovered in a van, having been placed there after being harmed in the family home. The discovery triggered an investigation that quickly focused on Valessa and her boyfriend Adam Davis, who had fled. The couple's flight suggested consciousness of guilt, though they would later claim other motivations for leaving. Valessa's relationship with her mother had been contentious. Vicki disapproved of Valessa's boyfriend and drug use, creating ongoing conflict in their household. The typical mother-teenager disputes about autonomy and choices had escalated beyond normal bounds, with Vicki attempting to control Valessa's associations and activities. The influence of Adam Davis proved significant in what occurred. He was older and involved with substances, representing the dangerous relationship Vicki feared. Davis encouraged and participated in actions against Vicki, with evidence suggesting he played a leading role while Valessa followed along. However, prosecutors argued that following along still constituted criminal participation. What evidence demonstrated Valessa's involvement? Physical evidence from the scene connected both Valessa and Davis to what occurred. Forensic analysis established timeline and method used to end Vicki's life. Witness testimony described the couple's behavior before and after, including their flight and attempts to evade capture. The trial became highly publicized in Florida, with media coverage focusing on the young age of the perpetrators and the mother-daughter relationship destroyed. Valessa was convicted on charges related to her mother's death, with the jury determining she bore criminal responsibility despite her youth and Davis's influence. The verdict reflected their conclusion that she participated actively rather than being merely present. Valessa was initially sentenced to life imprisonment, a term that would have kept her incarcerated indefinitely. However, Florida's approach to juvenile sentencing evolved over subsequent years. Legal changes affecting those who were minors at the time of their offenses created opportunities for sentence review and possible reduction. After serving years, Valessa was released from prison following resentencing that reduced her term. The release came after evaluations suggesting she had been rehabilitated and no longer posed significant danger. Florida's parole system determined that continued incarceration served no purpose given her progress and changed circumstances. Life after release proved challenging for Valessa. She had entered prison as a teenager and emerged as an adult, having missed crucial developmental years. She eventually became a mother herself, experiencing parenthood from the opposite side of the mother-daughter relationship she destroyed. The irony of raising offspring while having taken her own mother's life wasn't lost on observers. For Vicki Robinson's family, Valessa's release reopened wounds. They had lost Vicki to her own daughter's actions and struggled with the knowledge that Valessa now lived freely. Victim impact statements during resentencing described permanent loss and concern about justice being served with a reduced sentence. But another case would involve a New Year's Eve discovery in New York. Destiny Sanchez. On New Year's Day 2016, New York City police discovered 2 bodies in a Brooklyn apartment. The victims were 38-year-old Rosie Sanchez and her boyfriend. The person responsible was Rosie's 15-year-old daughter, Destiny Sanchez, who had ended both lives, then spent New Year's Eve partying in Times Square while the bodies remained in the apartment. Destiny initially claimed she had been experiencing mistreatment that drove her to act, allegations that a relative immediately disputed. The relative stated Destiny was lying about the claimed mistreatment, insisting Rosie had been a caring mother. The conflicting accounts made determining truth difficult, with Destiny's version challenged by those who knew the family. The method and timing of the acts suggested planning rather than spontaneous defensive reaction. Destiny had time to end both lives, leave the apartment, and participate in New Year's Eve celebrations. She was captured on video footage in Times Square during the iconic ball drop celebration, appearing to enjoy herself while 2 bodies lay in her home. The disconnect between celebrating and what awaited her return home disturbed investigators. How did authorities discover what occurred? Someone who knew the family contacted police when unable to reach Rosie. Officers performed a wellness check at the apartment and discovered both bodies. The scene indicated both victims had been deceased for some time. Evidence at the scene connected Destiny to the deaths. When questioned, Destiny initially maintained her story about reacting to mistreatment. However, physical evidence contradicted aspects of her account. The forensic details suggested the victims hadn't been engaged in actions Destiny claimed necessitated her response. The evidence indicated they had been caught off guard rather than posing imminent threats. Family members who disputed Destiny's allegations emphasized that Rosie had been a good mother, working to provide for her daughter and maintain their home. They described normal mother-teenager conflicts, but nothing approaching what Destiny alleged. The relatives' certainty that Destiny fabricated justifications suggested motivations beyond self-defense. Destiny was charged as a juvenile with counts related to both deaths. New York's juvenile justice system faced the challenge of balancing her age against the serious nature of 2 lives taken. The decision about whether to try her as an adult or in juvenile court involved weighing various factors, including her maturity, the calculated nature of the acts, and rehabilitation potential. The case drew significant media attention, particularly the detail about her Times Square celebration while bodies remained in her apartment. The image of a teenager enjoying New Year's festivities knowing what awaited at home crystallized public perception of callousness. The timing made the case memorable beyond its already disturbing elements. For Rosie's family and friends, the betrayal by someone Rosie had devoted her life to raising created profound grief. They mourned not just Rosie, but also her boyfriend, who had been incorporated into their family structure. The double loss and the knowledge that Destiny caused both deaths left lasting trauma. The legal proceedings examined whether Destiny's youth warranted more lenient treatment, or whether the nature of her actions demanded harsh consequences. Mental health evaluations assessed her state of mind and whether psychiatric factors affected her capacity. The evaluations would influence both prosecution strategy and eventual sentencing. Another case would take us to Canada.
Okay, so he phones you and he says, I have a knife with an 8-inch blade and I'm going to Stephanie's house. What was your response to that?
Like, okay, do whatever you want.
And what did that mean? What did you take that to mean when you said that? What did you mean when you said, okay, do whatever you want?
I meant, if you want to kill her, kill her.
Did you say those words?
I said, do whatever you want.
Well, that's not if you want to kill her, kill her.
You just said, what did I mean?
So he phones you and he says, I have an 8-inch blade knife and I'm going to Stephanie's house. And your response is, do whatever you want. What did he say to that?
Can't remember.
Did you think of calling 911 and reporting that there was a guy on a delivery to a young girl's house with a knife to kill her?
No.
How come?
I don't know.
Melissa Todorovich. In January 2008, Toronto, Canada experienced a case driven by jealousy that would result in a young life lost. Melissa Todorovich, just 15, orchestrated a plot targeting Stephanie Rengel, a romantic rival. The case exposed how teenage jealousy, when combined with obsessive thinking and manipulation, can escalate to deadly outcomes. Todorovich was fixated on her ex-boyfriend and couldn't accept that he had moved on. When he began a relationship with Stephanie Rengel, Todorovich's jealousy transformed into dangerous obsession. Rather than process the breakup and move forward, she fixated on eliminating what she viewed as an obstacle to rekindling her previous relationship. Todorovich pressured her then-boyfriend David Bagshaw to attack Stephanie, using manipulation and emotional coercion to convince him to act. Over weeks, she sent hundreds of messages pushing him toward the act, wearing down his resistance through persistent pressure. The digital communication trail would later provide prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and Todorovich's role as orchestrator. On the night of the attack, Bagshaw stabbed Stephanie multiple times outside her home, following through on what Todorovich had been demanding. Stephanie died from her wounds, a 14-year-old whose life ended because of teenage romantic jealousy. The senseless nature of her death, killed over a boyfriend situation that would have been forgotten within years under normal circumstances, made the tragedy particularly painful. The investigation quickly identified both Todorovich and Bagshaw as responsible. Communications between them provided damning evidence of the plot, with Todorovich's messages showing sustained pressure on Bagshaw to carry out the attack. Text messages, emails, and other digital communications created a timeline of how the plot developed from idea to execution. Both faced charges, with prosecutors arguing that Todorovich bore significant responsibility despite not wielding the weapon herself. She was convicted on charges related to Stephanie's death and sentenced to life imprisonment, making her one of Canada's youngest individuals to receive such a sentence for orchestrating another's death. During incarceration, Todorovich participated in rehabilitation programs aimed at addressing the jealousy and obsessive thinking that drove her actions. Mental health treatment examined her attachment patterns and taught healthier ways of processing relationship disappointments. Her progress during incarceration would later influence parole decisions. After serving years, Todorovich sought parole, arguing she had been rehabilitated and no longer posed danger. Parole board evaluations assessed her risk level, her understanding of what she had done, and whether she had genuinely changed. The evaluations considered both her crime's severity and her progress during imprisonment. In 2018, Todorovich breached parole conditions, resulting in her return to custody. The breach demonstrated that reintegration challenges remained despite apparent progress. Parole officers determined she had violated terms of her release, requiring her to complete additional time in more structured settings. Most recently, in September 2025, Todorovic was granted day parole, allowing her to reside in a halfway house with supervision. The board determined she had made sufficient progress since her previous parole breach and that graduated reintegration with support was appropriate. The parole decision noted she now represented low risk based on current evaluations. For Stephanie Rengel's family, each parole hearing and release decision reopens their grief. They lost Stephanie to teenage jealousy that should never have escalated beyond hurt feelings and social awkwardness. Victim impact statements describe permanent loss and concern that Todorovic receives freedoms Stephanie never will. The final case would involve a politician's daughter in Las Vegas, Sierra Halseth. In April 2021, Las Vegas experienced a case that shocked the community given the prominent nature of the victim's family. Sierra Halseth, 16, and her boyfriend, Aaron Guerrero, attacked Sierra's father, Daniel Halseth, in his home. Daniel was a former Nevada state politician, making the case particularly notable. Daniel was stabbed 70 times in a sustained attack that demonstrated extreme rage or determination. The number of wounds indicated this wasn't a brief confrontation, but rather a prolonged assault. After the stabbing, the couple attempted to burn Daniel's body to destroy evidence, showing awareness they had committed serious crimes. Sierra's relationship with her father had been troubled. Daniel and Sierra's mother had gone through a bitter divorce that affected Sierra's relationship with both parents. The divorce created ongoing tension and conflict that Sierra struggled to navigate. However, her family would later deny that Daniel had done anything warranting such violence. Sierra claimed she had experienced mistreatment that motivated the attack, though family members disputed these allegations. They insisted Daniel had been a caring father despite the difficult divorce. The conflicting accounts made determining the true nature of their relationship challenging for those outside the family. Guerrero's influence on Sierra became a focal point. He had mental health issues and used substances including LSD, factors that affected his judgment and potentially encouraged the violent solution to Sierra's family conflicts. The question of whether Sierra would have acted without Guerrero's involvement remained debated. What evidence sealed their fate? Surveillance video captured the couple fleeing Las Vegas after the attack, driving toward Salt Lake City, where they were eventually apprehended. The flight demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Additional evidence included forensic analysis of the scene, the attempted burning, and digital communications between them discussing their plans. Both Sierra and Guerrero faced trial. In October 2022, they were convicted and sentenced for their roles in Daniel's death. Sierra received life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 22 years, while Guerrero received a similar sentence. Nevada's sentencing balanced their youth against the calculated nature of the attack and attempted cover-up. In 2025, Guerrero gave an interview discussing the case and expressing regret. He stated he and Sierra no longer have contact, suggesting they blame each other or simply want to move past their shared crime. His reflections acknowledged the LSD use and mental health issues affected his decision-making, but didn't fully excuse his participation. Sierra serves her sentence in Nevada prison, facing 22 years before parole eligibility. She will be in her late 30s before any possibility of release, having spent her entire young adulthood imprisoned. The sentence ensures she experiences consequences for decades, while theoretically allowing eventual reintegration if she demonstrates rehabilitation. For Daniel Halseth's family, Sierra's actions represented the ultimate betrayal. They emphasized that Sierra's claims about mistreatment were false, defending Daniel's character and insisting he had been a good father despite the challenging divorce. Their victim impact statements described devastation at losing Daniel to his own daughter's choices. The 70 stab wounds haunted those familiar with the case. Such sustained attacks suggested either extreme rage accumulated over time or complete emotional detachment during the act. Psychologists who examined Sierra attempted to understand what psychological state allowed someone to inflict that many wounds on their own father. The case sparked discussions in Las Vegas about warning signs when teenage romantic relationships become dangerous influences. Schools and community organizations examined how to identify when a boyfriend or girlfriend encourages harmful actions against family members. Sierra's case illustrated how manipulative relationships can lead teenagers to choices they might not make independently. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.